My phone rang before sunrise. I answered with sleepy eyes, expecting a normal call from my son. Instead, Kellen spoke in a cold voice I barely recognized. He told me he had already filed legal papers and the ranch belonged to him now. Then he left and said I would leave with nothing. Before I could even process his words, he ended the call. I sat on the edge of my bed trying to understand what had just happened. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's truck stopped outside my house. My stomach dropped. That was the moment I realized my own son had truly turned against me. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I had spent most of my life working on that ranch beside my husband before he passed away. Every fence, every horse stall, every acre carried memories of our hard years together. After my surgery a few months earlier, I trusted Kellen to handle paperwork while I recovered. I never imagined he would use that chance to take control of everything. When I called my lawyer, he sounded nervous and avoided my questions. Something felt wrong. The people around town suddenly treated me like I no longer mattered. Meanwhile, Kellen started meeting with rich buyers interested in the land. One night, while searching through old boxes in storage, I found an old accounting book that my husband had hidden years ago. Inside were records and signatures that changed everything. I finally understood Kellen had made a mistake he didn't know about yet. That was the night I stopped crying and started planning quietly. After my husband died, people told me to sell the ranch and move somewhere easier. They said raising a boy alone while running land that size would break me. Maybe it should have. There were winters when the pipes froze solid, storms that killed half our cattle, and months when I barely slept more than a few hours. Still, I stayed because this ranch was the only thing my husband left behind for us. Kellen was only 12 when his father died. Back then, he was kind and full of life. He used to follow me through the barns carrying tools too heavy for him, trying to act grown. I believed those hard years were making him stronger. I never noticed they were also changing him in other ways. As he got older, he cared more about money than family. Things became worse after he married Leora. She always looked at the ranch like it was a business deal instead of a home. Every conversation with her somehow turned into numbers, land value, or profit. Slowly, Kellen started speaking the same way. At first, it was little things. He stopped asking how I felt. Then he began ordering me around like one of the ranch workers. Some mornings I cooked meals for everyone, cleaned equipment, and handled chores while he acted like he was doing me a favor by letting me stay there. One evening, I walked past the kitchen and heard them talking quietly. Leora mentioned a nursing home outside the county. Kellen answered that it would solve problems faster. I stood there frozen, listening to my own son discuss me like I was some burden he needed to remove. A few days later, I discovered I could no longer access the ranch accounts. That hurt more than anything else. Not because of the money, but because I finally understood the truth. Kellen no longer saw me as his mother. To him, I was simply standing in the way of what he wanted. 2 days after Kellen's phone call, I drove into town before sunrise. I barely slept the night before. My hands shook the whole drive to the county records office. Part of me still hoped there had been some mistake. I wanted someone to tell me my son couldn't really do this to me. A young clerk pulled out several files and placed them on the counter. The moment I looked down, my chest tightened. My name was signed across multiple transfer papers, but the handwriting wasn't mine. Whoever copied it tried hard to make it look real, but I knew every curve of my own signature after signing checks and contracts for decades. The clerk avoided eye contact and quietly said everything had already been approved weeks earlier. After leaving the office, I went straight to the bank. One employee there had known me for years. She looked nervous while speaking to me and kept checking over her shoulder. Finally, she admitted Kellen had been coming in for months preparing documents and moving money around. During my surgery recovery, he used temporary legal authority to gain access to accounts connected to the ranch. By the time I was healthy enough to notice, most of the livestock money was gone. Equipment titles had also been transferred into his name. Trucks, trailers, even machinery my husband bought years ago no longer legally belonged to me. The worst part was how everyone in town acted afterward. People smiled politely and told me I deserved retirement after working so hard. They believed I willingly handed everything to Kellen and stepped away from ranch life. I didn't correct them. Instead, I lowered my head, acted tired, and let people think I had accepted defeat. Meanwhile, late one night, I made a private phone call to Rhett Soren, an old friend of my husband's who used to practice law before retiring. When he heard my voice, he already knew something was terribly wrong. Rhett came to my house carrying 2 dusty storage boxes filled with old ranch records. For 3 straight evenings, we sat at my kitchen table going through papers that hadn't been touched in years. Most of it looked useless at first: old tax forms, cattle receipts, land maps, faded letters from banks that no longer existed. Then Rhett suddenly stopped turning pages. He pulled out a thin document folded between 2 old contracts. The paper was yellow with age, and my late husband's signature sat at the bottom beside the name of an energy company I barely remembered. Rhett read through it twice before looking up at me with a serious expression. Back in the late 80s, a drilling company had signed an agreement connected to underground natural gas beneath our property. The company disappeared years later, but the legal rights tied to the land never vanished. According to the contract, those rights belonged only to me after my husband died. At first, I didn't fully understand why it mattered. Then Rhett explained something that made everything clear. The developers circling our ranch were never interested in cattle, barns, or open land. The gas access beneath the property was worth far more money than the ranch itself. Kellen had no idea. He thought he had stolen a struggling family ranch from an aging widow. In reality, he had rushed into deals without learning what actually gave the land value. The ownership papers he grabbed didn't include the underground rights attached to my name alone. For a long moment, I sat quietly thinking about my son. A part of me wanted to warn him before he ruined his own life completely. But then I remembered the coldness in his voice that morning on the phone. I remembered hearing him talk about putting me away like I was some problem to solve. Something changed inside me that night. For the first time since he was born, I stopped looking at Kellen as the little boy I raised. I finally saw him clearly as the man he had become. It did not take long for the town to change toward me. People who once sat at my table for coffee suddenly acted uncomfortable around me. Conversations became short and awkward. Some avoided eye contact completely. At first, I could not understand why. Then I started hearing small things here and there. Someone at the grocery store asked if I was feeling better. Another person gently suggested I should take it easy and let Kellen handle ranch business now. That was when I realized my son had been talking behind my back. He told people I was forgetting things. He claimed the stress of aging and surgery had affected my mind. Since everyone saw him as the hard-working son caring for his mother, they believed him without question. Women from church stopped visiting me. One even called to say Kellen asked people not to upset me with too much information. I hung up the phone and cried harder than I had in months. Things became worse at the livestock auction outside town. I only went because I wanted to see familiar faces and remind myself I still belonged there. While I was checking cattle prices, I tried asking one of the ranch workers about equipment repairs. Before the man could answer, Kellen stepped between us. With people standing nearby, he smiled tightly and told the worker not to confuse me with ranch details anymore because I was having trouble keeping things straight these days. A few people looked down awkwardly while others stared at me with pity. I felt humiliated standing there. Later that night, one person knocked quietly on my back door. It was Tobin Rusk, one of the ranch hands who had worked beside my husband years earlier. He told me not everyone believed Kellen's stories. Over the next few days, Tobin secretly brought copies of records and invoices he found in the ranch office. Some contracts had fake repair costs attached to them. Taxes were also being hidden through false paperwork. As I looked through the documents, I realized this was no longer just family betrayal. Kellen had built an entire web of lies around me. 3 days later, another envelope arrived at my door. I already knew it came from Kellen before I even opened it. Inside were official papers ordering me to leave the ranch house within 7 days. The same home where I had raised him, buried my husband's ashes nearby, and spent most of my adult life. I read the notice twice without feeling anything at first. Then I folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup. Kellen never bothered speaking to me directly after that. He acted like everything had become business now. Trucks belonging to developers started appearing near the property almost every afternoon. Expensive men in polished boots walked around measuring land while Kellen followed beside them smiling proudly. Meanwhile, I quietly packed my belongings into old cardboard boxes. Family photos, blankets, dishes my husband and I bought years ago, every item carried memories that suddenly felt heavy in my hands. One afternoon, Leora walked into the house while I was sorting clothes. She glanced at the worn jackets folded beside me and laughed softly. Then she asked why I was even bothering to pack all that old junk. Before leaving, she muttered that Kellen had carried me long enough and called me dead weight holding everyone back. I said nothing. That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. The truth was, I had already stopped wasting energy defending myself to people who wanted me broken. While Kellen celebrated in town almost every night, Rhett quietly worked behind the scenes. He filed legal paperwork connected to the ranch ownership and hidden land agreements without drawing attention. Kellen believed he had already won. That confidence made him careless. Every day, he moved closer to signing deals that would eventually trap him. He had no idea certain legal actions were already waiting for the right moment to surface. So I kept packing boxes. Slowly and acted like a tired old woman with nowhere left to go. Inside, though, I was calmer than I had been in weeks. I no longer needed revenge fueled by anger. I only needed patience. Over the next few weeks, Kellen started acting like a man who had already become rich. He drove through town in a brand new black truck that cost more than most people's homes around there. Expensive packages arrived almost daily at the ranch office. One afternoon, I even saw him showing off a gold watch to some investors while laughing loudly like he had already secured the biggest deal of his life. People talked. Small towns always do. Word spread that Kellen planned to leave the state after the sale closed. Leora bragged openly about buying a large house in Colorado with mountain views and private land. She walked around like she had already escaped the simple ranch life she always hated. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. The final contract meeting took place at a large office building nearly 2 hours away. Red asked me to dress nicely but say very little unless needed. The entire drive there, I stared out the truck window wondering whether my son would even look at me when we walked inside. When we entered the conference room, every conversation stopped immediately. Kellen looked completely shocked to see me standing beside Rhett. For a second, real panic flashed across his face before he forced himself to smile. The developers already had folders open across the table. Maps, agreements, payment schedules, everything was prepared for signatures. Then Rhett calmly placed one document in front of him. At first, the men barely reacted while reading. But as they continued flipping through pages, the room slowly changed. Smiles disappeared. One man removed his glasses and reread the contract carefully. Another asked Kellen whether he disclosed the underground ownership rights connected to the property. Kellen looked confused. That was when I finally spoke. I explained the gas and mineral rights had never legally transferred with the ranch land. Those rights still belonged solely to me. Silence filled the room. One developer suddenly slammed his folder shut and demanded answers from Kellen. Another warned him he may have committed serious fraud by hiding critical information during negotiations. Kellen kept trying to speak, but nobody trusted him anymore. For the first time since all this began, I watched fear replace arrogance in my son's eyes. Everything started falling apart for Kellen after that meeting. The developers immediately paused the land deal and brought in their own legal team to review every document connected to the ranch. Once investigators began digging deeper, more problems surfaced almost overnight. The forged signatures were discovered first. Experts compared old records to the transfer papers and quickly noticed the differences. After that, bank transactions were examined more closely. Large amounts of money had been moved between accounts in ways that raised serious questions. People in town who once supported Kellen suddenly became distant. Nobody wanted their name connected to possible fraud. One cold morning, I looked out my kitchen window and saw several vehicles pull into the ranch driveway. The same sheriff who had handed me eviction papers stepped out first. This time, though, he was not there for me. Kellen walked outside trying to act calm, but I could see panic spreading across his face. Two investigators carried boxes filled with financial records taken from the ranch office. They questioned him for nearly an hour while workers stood nearby pretending not to watch. Leora stayed close to Kellen at first, but the moment investigators mentioned criminal charges and missing funds, her attitude changed completely. Within days, she hired her own lawyer and started blaming everything on Kellen. She claimed she knew nothing about forged documents or hidden money. Watching them turn on each other felt strange. Just weeks. They acted unstoppable together. Now they were fighting to protect themselves. Late one evening, Kellen knocked quietly on my front door. For the first time in months, he looked less like an angry businessman and more like a frightened man who finally understood the damage he caused. He asked me to help him fix things before it became worse. He said we were family and begged me not to let everything collapse. I listened silently while he spoke. Then I looked at the same son who once tried forcing me out of my own home without mercy. And for the first time in my entire life, I turned away from him without shedding a single tear. A week after investigators searched the ranch, Red asked me to meet him at his office. He placed a thick folder on the desk and said there was one final document my husband never wanted opened unless something went terribly wrong inside the family. I remember staring at the folder for a long time before touching it. Inside was a trust agreement created shortly before my husband died. I knew he had organized some financial papers back then, but I never understood how detailed everything really was. My husband had spent months protecting the ranch before the accident took his life. As Red explained the documents, pieces of the past suddenly made sense. My husband had worried that too much money or land control might someday change Kellen. That fear sounded impossible to me years ago. Back then, our son was still young, hardworking, and full of dreams. But my husband prepared anyway. The ranch itself had never been meant to fully transfer into Kellen's name unless certain conditions were met over time. There were strict protections built into the trust. Any attempt involving fraud, intimidation, or illegal property transfers would automatically remove inheritance rights connected to the land. Kellen triggered every one of those conditions himself. When his lawyer finally reviewed the trust documents, there was no way around it. Legally, he had destroyed his own claim to the ranch through his actions. News traveled fast across town after that. People who ignored me for months suddenly started visiting again. Some apologized for believing the rumors about my mental health. Others admitted they should have asked questions before taking Kellen's side. A few even brought food or flowers like that could somehow erase everything. I listened politely, but something inside me had changed. The same people who once shared meals in my kitchen had turned away from me the moment things became uncomfortable. They chose gossip over loyalty because it was easier. So I thanked them for coming, accepted their words quietly, and closed the door each time. Forgiveness may sound noble, but trust is much harder to rebuild once people show you who they truly are. The months after everything came out were quiet in a different way. Not empty, just slower. I started waking up early again, not from stress, but from habit I thought I had lost. Tobin stayed on and helped me bring life back to parts of the ranch that had been ignored or damaged. We fixed broken fences, cleaned storage sheds, and checked on the land piece by piece. Some days were exhausting, but it felt honest. Like rebuilding something that had been waiting for me to return. A few former workers who had helped Kellen were suddenly gone from town. I didn't ask many questions, but word spread that investigators had uncovered more financial issues tied to their work. The system that once protected Kellen's choices had started to collapse around everyone involved. Little by little, the ranch began to look like itself again. Not perfect, not untouched, but steady. The animals returned to normal routines. Even the land felt calmer, as if it could finally breathe. Kellen's life, on the other hand, kept falling apart. The legal pressure drained him faster than anyone expected. Court cases, settlements, and penalties kept stacking up until most of his money disappeared. The future he once bragged about slowly faded into something smaller and harsher. Leora left him when there was nothing left to gain. After that, he stopped coming to town altogether. For me, life didn't become joyful overnight. There were still moments when silence felt heavy, especially in places where I once expected to hear his voice. I would sometimes catch myself remembering him as a child, before everything changed. But those moments passed. One evening, I stood outside watching the sun go down over the land my husband once loved. The air was calm, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was surviving anything. I felt like I was finally living again. Still, a part of me never fully healed. Losing the ranch almost broke me, but losing my son in the process left a wound that time couldn't completely close. Months passed without any word from Kellen. Life settled into a routine I had almost forgotten existed. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door that didn't feel familiar. When I opened it, he was standing there. He looked different. Not the confident man who once walked through town like he owned it, but someone worn down by time and mistakes. His clothes were simple, his face tired, and his eyes carried a heaviness I hadn't seen before. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He stepped inside slowly, as if unsure he even belonged in the house anymore. I offered him a seat at the table, the same place where so many arguments had started before. He kept staring at his hands while speaking. His voice was lower than I remembered, almost uncertain. He asked if I ever truly loved him, even after everything that had happened between us. The question stayed in the air longer than expected. I told him the truth. I said I had loved him more than myself for most of my life, even when it cost me peace, sleep, and dignity. That didn't change easily. But I also told him something he probably didn't want to hear. Love doesn't mean losing yourself completely for someone who keeps hurting you. He nodded slowly, like he already understood but needed to hear it anyway. Then he apologized for everything he had done, not just once, but several times, as if repetition could fix what was already broken. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was nothing left to add. The damage between us wasn't something a conversation could repair anymore. Too many lines had been crossed, too many choices made. He stood up eventually, hesitating near the door like he hoped I might call him back. I didn't. He left quietly, and I stayed where I was, knowing some relationships don't end with anger or shouting. Some simply fade into silence, even when both people are still alive. A year later, mornings feel different. I sit on the porch with a warm cup in my hands and watch light slowly spread across the fields. The same land that once felt heavy with memory now feels settled, like it finally found balance again. Work on the ranch continues, but it no longer feels like survival. Tobin and I handle things side by side. He knows the land well, and more importantly, he respects what it means to care for it. We don't rush anymore. We fix what needs fixing and let the rest wait its turn. I decided to start something in my husband's name, a small fund to help families who depend on ranch work but struggle to stay afloat during hard seasons. It isn't about making noise or recognition. It's about giving back in a way that feels right. Some days I still think about everything that happened. Not with anger, just understanding. People show their true nature when pressure builds, and I learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. What I once thought would break me ended up shaping me instead. I no longer measure my life by what was taken or lost. I measure it by what I was able to rebuild after everything fell apart. There are moments when I think about Kellen, but they don't stay long. Some bonds don't return to what they once were. No matter how much time passes. Still, I don't carry bitterness anymore. that part of me has finally settled. Before the sun rises higher, I lean back in my chair and let the quiet morning air settle around me. The ranch feels alive again, not perfect, but steady enough to move forward. And in that stillness, I understand something I never fully saw before. Strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from standing up after everything you thought would end you. My son thought age made me weak. But surviving betrayal taught me something different. The strongest people are the ones who've already lost everything once before. I really want to know what you think about my decision in this story. Do you feel I did the right thing, or should I have given them another chance? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'm curious to hear your opinion. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.